Hey, George Haas here. I wanted to continue our conversation around Dharma maps and talk about absolute versus conceptual realities. It's one of these investigations, um, also a conceptual way of understanding practice. What we're looking for is the experience of actually sensing. That's the absolute or ultimate reality. The touchstone that we can go back to as a base for examining whether the thing that we've made that sensing experience into is an accurate reflection coming from a place of equanimity, or whether it's distorted by various hindrances. So looking at the sensing experience itself, knowing the sensing experience itself differently than what we make the sensing experience into. Because of the nature of the human condition, the way that the human body works, and we know this from contemporary neuroscience, consciousness runs a half a second behind what's actually happening. So for most experiences, the sensing process has already been categorized and made into something by the time it enters consciousness. So we're looking at a deconstructing process. It's only when you experience things that you don't know what they are, and that if that process lasts longer than a half a second, that you have the opportunity to experience it consciously as the body-mind tries to figure out what it is. The aspects of memory in being human is oriented around recognizing patterns, classifying them, and then assigning meaning to them. And that process happens quickly. There's a research that's been done around the processing times. There's a volume called Mind Time, which lays out all of those studies. It's about 3/8 of a second to process dangerous material, about a half a second to process pleasant material. The vast majority of sensing experience never enters consciousness, so that we never get to know directly what that experience is. If you accept these numbers, and you can easily Google this stuff, the body-mind processes information at about 11 million bits per second, but the conscious experience of that 11 million bits is only 16 bits, 1/6. So we live in this experience of mostly unconsciousness driving everything, and then we have these bulletins that come into conscious experience where we know what's happening in a very limited way. We often call this in Buddhist circles wisdom mind, prajna, to know the experience of this body-mind activity as an inference from what comes into conscious awareness. Conscious awareness exists mainly as a veto option. So the body-mind senses something, it processes the sensing, it makes a decision about what the sensing is, it formulates a plan of action in response to the conditions of the present moment, and at the last moment, just as the body-mind is moving to carry out the decision processes that were unconscious, the body-mind asks, do you really want to do this? And we have the capacity then to veto it. Vetoing is not the same, of course, as originating the idea of doing it. That's a process that still remains unconscious. So we want to be able to touch into the sensing experience itself as much as we can, even though that takes some training to be able to do that. Most of the time, the fixated, solid experience of the world arises in consciousness, and we accept that as an accurate representation of what's happening. And so in this process of insight meditation, we begin to pull these elements apart so that we can see clearly what's happening, notice the mind states that may be affecting the way that the sensing experience is made into the solid world. And in order to understand this process of sensing and making the sensing into something, and what the mind state might be that filters it, that alters the way that the world appears, the way that we appear to ourselves, we need to be able to touch into the sensing. So when we're talking about the momentary concentration insight practice, or Karnika Samadhi, we're talking about a noting practice where we pay attention to where our awareness is. We note it. That is to say, we know where our attention is, and then we intentionally soak in to touch into the quality of the sensing experience, so that we can compare that sensing experience with the thing that we've made it into. So we talk about ultimate or absolute reality only as the sensing experience, and the thing that we make the sensing experience into conceptual reality. And that we understand, because of the variation in the way that the body-mind can make conventional reality out of the absolute reality, that the conceptual reality is unreliable. So we're attempting to train the body-mind into this dance of seeing what the body-mind has made out of the sensing experience, and then touching into the sensing experience to see if we can compare the two, and that seems to be an accurate reflection. So if the body-mind is equanimous, then the representation of the sensing experience tends to be an accurate reflection to what's happening. So the conceptual reality tends to be an accurate reflection of the absolute reality. But if the mind is distorted by the hindrances, when the Buddha talked about this, he talked about a bowl of water reflecting the light of the world and creating an image. If the water is still and calm and clear, then the absolute experience is then reflected conceptually in an accurate way. But if the mind, say, were filled with craving, it would be as if the water were dyed bright colors. And that reflection, as it is manifest off the surface of the water, infuses those bright colors which are brought to the experience of forming self and world through the mind state of craving. If the mind state is aversion, it's as if the water were boiling, and so that the image of the world is quite distorted from what it would be. Touching back into the pure sensing, and then watching this process of the world being formed, the self being formed, noticing that the mind state of anger is present, and then investigating how the mind state of anger affects the quality of the experience of conceptual reality, touching back and forth between conceptual and absolute. If the mind were restless and agitated, it's as if a breeze were blowing across the surface of the water, distorting the image with restlessness. If the mind were filled with sloth and torpor, it's as if the water were overgrown with algae, affecting the way that we see the world and self. If the mind is filled with doubt, it's as if the water were muddied. So the reflection off the surface is infused with the experience of doubt. So the sensing experience is there, the mind state that affects the formation of conceptual reality is there, and then the reality that's formed through that mind state. I often like to talk about John Bowlby's attachment theory, and how conditioning then creates these mind states that can arise based on attachment in the Western psychological sense. You experience the ultimate reality or absolute reality, the sensing experience of it, and then your conditioning affects the mind state, so that if you have a secure way of being connected in the world, attached in relationships in the world, the mind state of security arises, and then the world that you create is then reflective of the sensing experience filtered through the mind state. So this would not be, for instance, a state of perfect equanimity, the secure mind state. It would be biasing the quality of experience through this idea that you're capable and that the world is filled with people who would be responsive to you. And so you move through the world in that way. We often talk about intentionally infusing the mind with metta mind. And this is, again, not an equanimous state of mind, but we're intentionally inclining the mind toward kindness so that the experience of self is infused with kindness, the experience of others in the world is infused with kindness, and so that our responses to them come in relationship to this quality that's embedded in a conceptual reality. If, going back to the Bowlby attachment model, if the mind is activated in a dismissing strategy, then the ultimate experience is filtered through that dismissing strategy, and that the way that the world looks then takes on that quality. So in a dismissing mind state, there tends to be an inflated sense of self-value, and there's a devaluing sense of everyone else. So you see yourself as better and everyone else as worse. If a preoccupied mind state arises, that distorts the absolute perception by creating a sense that the self is helpless, but that everybody else is capable. And if the mind, a state of fearful avoidance arises, then the perception is that the self is incapable and the world is filled with people who would be intentionally harming. If you don't investigate this, then you tend to take on a belief that this is how the world is. If you're not paying attention to this dance between the sensing experience and what the sensing experience is made into, you don't see the distortion, and so you act as if it's undistorted. In seeing the distortion, then you can know through experience what the world might look like without the distortion, what your sense of self might be without the distortion, and then you can act from the place that's not distorted, even if the current presentation is, and in this way change the nature of the karma that unfolds. I like to talk about karma as taking an action, and then that action creates the possibility for the next choices that you have. So that if the mind is clear and you take skillful action, then you tend to have a better set of options than if you make a choice and take an unskillful action, and then what comes back from that are less skillful choices. Next time we'll begin to talk about the map of the 16 stages and how to proceed with the progress of insight. Thanks.